Thank you for joining this first session. You're the first tranche of what we're calling RIF champions. The concept of this champion is a user who is knowledgeable enough about the system to be able to communicate with their peers about it. So this is our first run through this. So we've tailored this towards the IPCC, but yeah, as you can probably imagine, we're trying to build a wider community as well. So the purpose of today's workshop is to get you, the first tranche of IPCC champions, started on a journey of understanding and potentially even contributing to the REF, the Rapid Evaluation Framework, in future. So this may mean various different things to different people, but generally this could include supporting your colleagues as they try to understand the REF and probably communicating what problems it can and potentially can't solve. So today we're going to go through a few different things. One of the key understandings coming out of this should be that there's two main parts to the Rapid Evaluation Framework. There is the stable, community-led assessment fast-track deployment that you may have seen at the dashboard that we're referring to it. This is the latest set of diagnostics for the assessment fast track. Behind all of that, there is an extensible software framework which we've developed to be able to implement that deployment. And this could be used to enable support for some short turnaround responses, and potentially something that could be a bit more IPCC focused, but we'll get to that a bit later. So broadly, we're going to outline how we imagine that the assessment fast track REF could help the workflows of different IPCC authors. Here we're going to focus on particularly working group 1, but this may also have applicability in the other working groups. Here I said how we think that this may work. So what we're really looking for is some feedback on if there's any gaps or any functionality or any data that we would need to add to the assessment fast track REF, particularly through your lenses as IPCC authors, which is one particular group of users that we think that the REF would be well used for. So the goal would be to, after this workshop, be able to explore some of the overview material that I've prepared and be able to explain how the assessment fast track could support you or others' work within the IPCC, and also at a later date to be able to provide some feedback and on the different things that we may need to add and what's missing. So a brief overview of the agenda. First of all, we're going to start with what is the REF, which is always a good place to start. Then we're going to look at what the REF can do today, and then we're going to run through an example where we're going to look at a potential how the REF could help the IPCC figure generation workflows. I'll run through a demo of some notebooks. Then, as with all new software projects, we'll discuss a few of the current gaps as we see them, as well as talking about some provenance and citation information that's on the way. After that, there'll be a break after that, and then we'll go into some a bit more of a deep dive into behind the scenes. How does it all work? How do you get some information about the dashboard and other results, other ways of querying the results? So there's going to be 2 Q&A sessions, as well as a nice comfort break in the middle, hopefully in the middle at least. So maybe let's start off with what is the REF? I'm sure there's been various, maybe you've heard about this before. I mean, obviously, if you've joined the workshop, you've at least heard of it. So the Rapid Evaluation Framework orchestrates the execution of a number of community implemented climate model diagnostics in a consistent, traceable way, and publishes the resulting metrics, figures, and provenance information to use. It's designed to be able to use to generate model evaluation results to help users understand more about the CMIP 6 and now CMIP 7 models. but like if we dive into a little bit more, the REF is fundamentally a tool for running diagnostics on our system model output and collecting the results. It's very much enforces the standardization. This is a community tool. It's brought together a number of different packages. ESM tool, PMP, ILAM are all providing data in the same consistent format. That means that users are able to consume that in the same way. It doesn't matter where your diagnostic was actually run. We're also tracking the results in a database. So as evaluations are performed and we generate a lot of output, we track those results and all the different interconnections between the results and the data sets in a database to be able to query at a later date and also roll backwards in time to go back to a very specific version that was released on a given day. It's also been designed to be very extensible to support very different requirements. One of the key requirements when we built the thing was to be able to run not only on Kubernetes, which is how ESGF runs some of its infrastructure, but also via just Docker containers, and also on your laptop, and also on HPCs. They're all very different environments, probably potentially more different than I expected at the start, but yeah, so we had to be able to come up with a framework where we support many different users, not only from the diagnostic side. We've currently applied this and we've built the tools using the CMIP 6 data to kind of demonstrate its capabilities. But now we're really looking forward to this first tranche of CMIP 7 data coming through very, very soon. The whole goal of the REF was to be able to exploit these data as soon as they're published. So we have a collection of data that is near real time. Previously, this step may have taken, you'd have to wait for months to years for the different papers to come out, whereas now you can kind of get a glimpse at some of the data earlier on in the cycle. So I'm not going to read the slide in detail, but this is an excerpt from a slide by the Model Benchmarking Task Team outlining the goals and the outcomes for the REF. The piece here that I'm highlighting is that even at the very conception of the rapid evaluation framework, there was the idea that the IPCC assessment cycles would be a key user that could be supported by this particular set of tools. So it's great to see us kind of getting there and now be able to start this communication and hopefully uptake of such tooling. Before I dive into it a bit more, standardization that's occurred throughout the community and throughout CMIP and the wider WCRP projects has been one of the catalysts for this particular piece of work. The desire for tooling to perform model analysis in short turnarounds has been on has been desired for many years. And so, but the real catalyst here is the ability now to have clear and consistent standardization around the metadata that are in data sets, as well as good quality assurance checks. There's been a lot of time and energy spent for the next CMIP 7 data sets to ensure that those processes are robust. And that just means that we can do more automated approaches to solve for different diagnostics now than we could have done previously. The other benefit here is that standardization as far upstream as possible means that everyone downstream uses the same set of data. The same thing with everyone can open SEMruize data sets. We hope that by providing a common interface for some of the model output at the model evaluation output, we're also able to kind of leverage that. So one of the distinctions that will come up time and time again throughout this workshop is this distinction between the framework versus the deployment. So the climate REF here in italics is the packages surrounding it that are implementing the software side of it. It is defining the interfaces that different diagnostics must implement, defining what a provider means, defining what a result looks like. Those pieces of code are incredibly important. and they set the kind of the groundwork for adding new diagnostics in. So this extensible framework means we can add in new diagnostics, new diagnostic providers as we need. But for the assessment fast track, we're looking at a very specific set of diagnostics. These are a set of diagnostics that have been determined by the CMIP model benchmarking task team through some community consultation. It's focused on CMIP 7 data sets while we built it on CMIP 6. And it's going to be deployed to both an ESGF East and West index node. So this is the community-facing, public-facing version of that. And that is, it's like the sacred configuration. So while I mentioned here a few times already that's designed to be extensible, it's still a work in progress. The framework, the timelines that we've been trying to target to get this ready for now have been relatively tight. So we've taken straight line paths to get to where we need to go in some cases, but there's work to be had in future to make sure that we can tease some of this apart and we're able to apply this to add new things and kind of expand the remit as we see fit. This overview figure is a good kind of high-level view of the different components that make up the REF. On the left here, we have our input data, both data sets, in this case CMIP 6 or CMIP 7 data, and observation data sets, reference data. All of those data are summarized, and we'll talk a bit more about the details about what does it mean to have, what do these input data have to conform with later. In the middle is the heart of the REF, where we take the set of data that we have available, some description of the diagnostics that we need to run. We can determine what potential executions we need to perform. We're then able to run them in the different community tools that are already pre-existing, so PMP, ILAM, and ESMVal tool. We can run them in variety of different ways depending on how we are trying to run this. And then finally, we save the results of those executions in a consistent manner that enables us to pull out the metric values, the log output, the output files in a consistent way across all different tools. Now, it's no good just making data if you can't access it. So since the focus of the tool so far has been this a much more of a public facing tool, we've implemented an API that enables users to query the results of the executions, and also we have the dashboard that you may have seen. This dashboard is a view on top of via the API of the same set of data. So the dashboard uses the API to query the database to determine what executions have been run, what results do I have. You could also do this programmatically if you want, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. And so that API also serves a lot of the output files, the NetCDF files, all of the native artifacts that are generated as part of a diagnostic. You could still get at the ESMVal tool provenance information, for example, or the native NetCDF file that's produced by an ESMVal tool run, if you need to dive right down into the details. The boxes, I've put some boxes around some things that are the bits that change depending on, that are very specific, to this assessment fast track deployment. The diagnostics are the key one. These are this set of community diagnostics that we'll go through. There's about 30 of them that target a broad range of the Earth system. The input data is also obviously very applicable. That's obviously targeting CMIP 7. And the dashboard itself is currently actually quite a bespoke thing for the assessment fast track. But, we'll go through that later as well. So, the REF itself is a software tool, right? And there's already these community tools. And so I guess trying to understand what's unique about it. I've broken it down to 4 main points here. So the database is something that makes this implementation relatively unique. This enables us to do some really cool things. We were able to query across different facets, different cuts across different executions that's relatively novel. Previously, executions or diagnostic output was very much siloed in the execution that was performed in. We're diagnostic agnostic in that we're providing common interfaces to work across a variety of tools. Doesn't matter which the source diagnostic provider was for the diagnostic you're interested in. It should look the same and feel the same from it to a consumer. There's also a big focus on the values rather than the figures. Now, this is actually, this is quite an interesting point here, in that since we're trying to make a tool that serves as broad an audience as possible, there's no one figure that is best suited to answer a given question. So we're very much interested in the value. So what is the ECS for this given model run? What is the time series from that given model output for a given region? Those are the things that these like tiny little bits of information that are very important, and many different people may have different views over them. So we want to collect all of these in a way that we're then able to cut and dice that data up and to make our own figures, and everyone can answer their own questions from the same set of data. That being said, the figures that are generated via the diagnostic packages are still incredibly important to understand what's happening, so we also expose them. There's also a focus on very small executions. This is relatively novel as well, because traditionally you may, if you're trying to calculate ECS for all the different models available in ESM-Valtor, I think they've made there's a new way around this now, but you would have had to list out all the different models you want to run. We're trying to take a look at it from the other way. We describe what data we want, and then we run these diagnostics, these executions on as small as possible chunk of data as we can. So that has two meanings. That means that if any data changes, we only have to recompute very small amounts of it. And it also means that we don't have to manually maintain lists of diagnostics, list of data sets that we want to run, for example. We're relying very heavily on the metadata that's included in the data sets to determine what's run. So the assessment fast track is not an evaluation package. It executes and tracks results from existing benchmarking and model evaluation packages, but it provides a common way of running it. It's not just a download tool, it's also very much about the computation and the interconnections between these diagnostic outputs that you would lose if you're just serving static output. And it's not necessarily a custom compute platform. We don't have the resources, compute resources, to enable users to fiddle with the different knobs to rerun different executions, for example, as they see fit. We're trying to choose a broad set of diagnostics that are applicable in many different places and run them in a consistent manner. So while I said that the assessment fast track doesn't include any custom diagnostics, you'll see in the dashboard that we do some custom, some dynamic figures that bring together all the different metric values from multiple different sources, or multiple different dimensions, and show them in the same figure in some cases. So, for example, a Taylor diagram. It's also at the very heart of, at the very start of this process, we were trying to develop this as a community tool. We're not wanting something that is only run by a single group. We want something where there is capacity across the whole community to be able to understand what's happening and be able to add and expand it as needed. So with that kind of project, there's also some community coordination that has to happen. And the governance for this particular project will be provided by ESMO. There's the establishment process of a panel there at the moment, with the CMIP specific diagnostics and related REF related matters will still be deferred to the CMIP panel for for final say. So we've put a lot of effort into making sure that this is an open source expandable tool, but that still requires some community agreement on where we go, what things we run, and it also requires the coordination to deliver both in person time and resourcing, to compute resourcing to get it done. So that was a quick, brief whirlwind of the very high-level part of the REF. So broadly, the REF provides a way of accessing a shared database of diagnostics and metric values. That's still very hand-wavy, but we'll dig into it a bit more in a second. The focus here is on managing the life cycle of the results and the interconnections between data sets and the results, because that's incredibly important. And while we devolve the actual implementation of the science to the community packages, which have been published and peer-reviewed in those particular implementations. We've talked a bit about the framework versus deployment, and also that we've built this as a community tool. So let's now move on to what can the REF actually do today. We're still very early on in, I guess, the CMIP 7 cycle, in that there's no data available at the moment, but we've still spent a lot of time and energy looking at CMIP 6 data to help build this thing out. So there is a number of different ways of accessing the REF results, the public assessment, the public deployment of the REF's results. You can do that via the dashboard. We will run through that later on, where you can browse, view, and download all results via your browser. You can dive down looking at a single diagnostic and then through to the single execution. But you could also look at this data explorer, where we've got a curated set of results and figures that may be of interest. You could also access the results programmatically via some scripts, some pipelines. This is probably the way that you would want to run it for an IPCC workflow. And also there's, this tool itself is able to be deployed locally if you so wish. So you could run custom data or diagnostics that could be run locally. The assessment fast track deployment will be hosted at CEDA and RNL in the coming months. I said will here because they've been very busy at the moment with the ESGF launch, which is happening very soon. So soon after that, the REF should be moved there, but the current results that you're seeing are hosted by Climate Resource. We don't yet have we don't have a full set of results, but it's a decent cross-cut of the available of the CMIP data that we had available to us for a number of different variants, and for most models. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the complete full set that's available in the SGF. So some of the links to some of the execution groups and things will change when that change happens. I'd also like to point out that the Joint Task Team on Responsible Data Use developed a note for the best practices for using this output. Some of this output could be used, if used incorrectly, could be confusing, as well as incorrect. So they put together some guidance, some community guidance on how one could interpret the results responsibly and rigorously. So yeah, if you're making use of the results, I recommend you check that out. So we briefly mentioned about governance before, but the REF was instigated by the Model Benchmarking Task Team about 2 years ago now, to provide the model evaluation for CMIP 7. And the Model Benchmarking Task Team also went out and engaged with the community on the sets of diagnostics that they were after. They came up with the initial set, which we're now on to version 2 of. The governance of these diagnostics is now in the process of being moved over to ESMO. where a panel is being established to oversee the criteria and the process for inclusion of new diagnostics in a community-supported REF. This governance layer is incredibly important here because we are using community resources. We're asking compute time from CEDA and ORNL to run these diagnostics. So we have to make sure that we're having as broad a set of diagnostics as possible. And yeah, so we're not misusing that. Now, I was a chapter author for AO6. I'm not chapter author, I was a contributing author for chapter 6. So I was involved in the figure generation process. So I can understand how there's, I guess, confliction there between the rapid iteration that's required to generate some of the figures within IPCC, the changing requirements, and a much more stable, long-term process that requires it requires some a lot of oversight and process to get a REF through. That there may be some conflict there. So this is, I guess, one of the bits where we don't yet have the full complete answer here for how we could possibly add all the different diagnostics that IPCC could potentially want. So we're showing you the first assessment fast track versions of these diagnostics, noting that there may be other ones that are needed. One potential way through this, which is not necessarily, isn't without effort, is potential of a staging, bit more is where it could be quicker iteration between results being decided, implemented, and put into some portal, but that, I guess, eventually the goal would always be convergence towards a community set of results. So if things get published in the reports, it'd be great if they end up eventually on the public version. But this whole process of how that would happen is still very much in the air. But hopefully at the end of this, we could get some feedback on what the kind of timelines and what things you would need. As you're probably well aware as we are, that CMIP 6 results will become available very soon on ESGF. I think the current timeline for the first publications was June 1st now. So the first few results that the REF sees will still require some manual iteration from our side, but we've done a lot of preparation and test data generation to make sure that we're at least somewhat ready for CMIP 7, so we can hit the ground running. The hope is that we're able to very quickly get the new CMIP 7 results into the portal, and so people can consume them quickly. So until there's some data threshold, data completeness, until there's sufficient number of models for a given diagnostic, we will be showing some banners around some of the given diagnostics when CMIP 7's data is shown, just to note that it's provisional. And there may be some issues that need to be resolved as we kind of work through seeing the first real world set of results. Now, maybe let's dive into a little bit about the how we could potentially support IPCC workflows. I've brought together a quick notebook that is, I guess, my first stab at the guess of how one might want to write a figure that uses the REF. But broadly, the process would look something like an author would be able to write some notebook or script, which typically in R or Python, which would query this API that we talked about before, would query it for some results. So ask for all of the ECS values, for example, for all different models. They would then be able to do some analysis on that and generate a figure that could then combine data from other sources. So for example, if there was some assessed ranges from various different areas that could come in as another table, and you can make your production ready figure. The REF itself was never really designed to make the production ready figures. It was designed to make the data that goes into the production ready figure. Now, in some cases, that may be that all of that data condenses down to just a single range on a chart that comes with a bunch of other data, but at least we're using the same sets of data. We'd also export some of the data and provenance information, so it sits beside this notebook, and there could be some helper functionality there to make sure we export the right sets of data. Now, the notebook, the provenance information, and the data would all become artifacts that are then tracked, like in AR6. And the beautiful bit here is that once the figure is ready, and it may be using a subset of models that were available at the time of building the notebook, it would be easy enough to run the notebook again and get the latest set as of that date from the ref. So the ref could have got 5 new models that have been published since then, calculated their ECS values, and returned them. And then that figure would just be updated without the need for any other running of extra calculations, for example. So this current workflow would work, or as it stands now, for the assessment fast track for the diagnostics that we have available. But what we're going to do here is, first of all, start with a little bit of a tutorial running through that example. So if we can all go to this GitHub link here, github.com/climate-ref/climate-ref.tutorials, and I will jump to that now, and we can step through the process. What we're going to do is we're going to open up a notebook. I used a thing called Binder, but today it wasn't working, so I have a quick workaround. But we'll get there. So I'm going to quickly go to this link, and I will hopefully meet you there. This repository here is a is my screen still visible? Sorry, my GitHub. Sorry.
Yeah, it is. It might be a bit clearer if you were on not dark mode. Possibly.
Okay.
If that's quick to change, it's just because the dark makes it a wee bit.
I hope that. Here we go.
Yeah, that's a bit clearer.
So this repository here contains a set of notebooks that we'll run through. But we're going to focus on a single one at the first. We're going to start with the most complicated one, and then we'll later move back to the less complicated ones. But hopefully this notebook gives a good oversight about how a publication process may work. So the first step would be you could either open this in Binder and jump to that. If Binder isn't working, but Binder is a service that hosts Jupyter notebooks on your behalf. Binder isn't working. You could also go to tutorials.climate-ref.org. I literally set this up 5 minutes ago, so this may not work, but that is another way of running it, or you could run these notebooks locally as well. We're going to look at notebooks and then the 5 ECS temperature figure. If you could also click through it on GitHub if you want. So I'm going to run it here. So let's start off with, if we all go to notebooks, 5 ECS temperature figure. Now, this notebook here runs us through one hypothetical figure that could be of interest. So here we're looking at the ECS values, equilibrium climate sensitivity values, and we're wanting to take also the global mean surface temperature for each model. In both cases here, we're looking at model means, and we're wanting to color the lines, those global mean surface temperature historical lines, by the color of the ECS, or the value of the ECS. So we can do that. So the first step there would be to fetch some ECS values for every CMIP model. We're then going to fetch all the historical time series for TAS from the ref as well. We're then going to join them together using the source ID and then make that figure. We have some inputs at the very start, but this first cell here, what this does is it makes a request to the API to ask for the ESM tool, equilibrium climate sensitivity data, and we want all the different scalar values that are produced by that diagnostic. Some of this may sound like gobbledygook, but when we get through to, I guess, showing how it could be used, we'll go back down in the layers and kind of describe each of these little bits in more detail, and hopefully then it makes a bit more sense. So where this particular call is asking the API for all the results for a given diagnostic, and then we make those, we then take those all those ECS values, we then group them by source ID, and we take the mean. So in this case here, we're making a model mean for all their different ECS values, and we get a data frame here. We're also able to query all of the historical TAS values. So here we're going to fetch the time series for the ESM tool global mean time series. We want only the historical, and we want only the surface temperature results. And we get and again we get a data frame of all the time, like by time, by model, all of the output. We then do some pandas averaging here. So when we have multiple ensemble members, we average them by year, and then we also calculate some anomaly with respect to 1850 to 1900. So here we're showing data up to 2014 because we're looking at CMIP 6 data, but you could imagine that these would then go to 2021 in the case of CMIP 7. And again, we've got a single column per model in this case, and then we can bring that together. So we've got ECS by model, and we've got time series of the model means, anomalies with respect to 1850 to 1900. We also have some other values. So for example, we know that the assessed range from AR6, very likely range for ECS was 2 to 5 degrees. And we can then, with some matplotlib, bring together and make a figure that could be ready, almost ready for publication, and we get a figure like this. So all this results here included no calculations locally. It's leveraged the existing data that's publicly available by the ref. We're using the same set of ECS that everyone else would be using to generate their figures, and we're able to come up with this figure. And this one's quite interesting because we're joining two different outputs from two different diagnostics into the one figure, and we're also bringing in some data from outside in the case of the assessed ranges. Now, this is just one example. We can save this out and use it for however we want. We could save the data out. We could store some other provenance information. We could capture, put this all together, and then this could be how we end up storing some of the production-ready figures. And if we want to change how we style this figure, we're not necessarily changing how we get the data, we're changing how we style the figure. So we could also take those same data and with some slightly different plotting, make a way of slicing those same sets of data. So I appreciate that that's a very high level overview about, and kind of abstracts away a lot of what is there, but I hope this kind of demonstrates the fact that there is some data that's available already, and we're able to fetch those, and we focus on how do we make the figure to communicate what we're trying to say, rather than how do we try and run the diagnostics, because the ref can handle a bit of that. We'll come back to these notebooks later on, but if this repository is a great way to kind of get your feet wet with how you could potentially how you could use the ref. There's some description of the different concepts involved, some more information about how you would actually query this API and the different primitives involved. There's another figure that we could generate. And then we also do a short example of how you would actually make a custom diagnostic. So that is a very quick whirlwind tour through that tutorial that we'll come back to in a second. So that notebook itself is able to be edited and tweaked as you see fit to play around with. Please have a go at playing with it and see what, see if you can get the information that you need but to be able to do it. And here again is here is the repository that you need that's useful. I guess that is the first glimpse at how the assessment fast track RIF could support the IPCC workflows. It's around providing this consistent, public, easily queryable set of data of pre-computed results based on the latest available data. So yeah, climate sensitivity, different ENSO values, time series of regional monthly mean temperature, standard deviation, or differences between observation data and model data, lots and lots of different things. So you can either have a look through the dashboard or the API to explore some of that stuff. And if some data is published to ESGF, we would expect it to soon appear in the REF. And if you see any errors or anything that's not quite right, please raise an issue on the GitHub repository here. So with this consistent set of data, we're hoping that this would help support consistency across different authors to avoid cases where, say, one author was using one set of models for their work while another was using another set, or even different methods for calculating different metrics or different evaluation metrics. We're also hoping that this would reduce the overall compute usage because each author doesn't need to try and run all the different diagnostics that are needed, or they can just simply download some of this pre-computed results. This is particularly of interest in the Global South. You don't necessarily need the terabytes and terabytes of data to get at the indicators that you need. We're also planning first-class support for reproducibility. That's a very important part of the IPCC workflows. Where maybe you want to select a subset of models, or you want to to pin the date when the data was used so that users would get the same experience as of the publication date. That is all, I guess, part of the framework that we're trying to build. And then there's also the idea of consistency across different working groups where there is, again, this common shared database of values. So there's also some problems that the RIF can't currently solve. So the RIF, we've got this governance structure, which is about supporting the community. And so if we need new sets of diagnostics and there's only 2 days to do it, the RIF cannot help you there. Or the public version of the RIF cannot help you there. It's very possible to get new diagnostics if we're not covering what you need through implementation and governance process and added to the RIF. That process is still being established, but that is the concept of how we're trying to get new data in. I'm well aware that this may not align with some of the IPCC timelines that we're looking at, particularly around faster turnarounds. So that's why we're trying to have this discussion early and now, so we can understand more about what is needed. This concept of a staging RIF could potentially be one option, but there's probably many other ways that we could achieve that too. So one other thing that the RIF is currently run on these ESGF index nodes, and we require local data to run it. So at the moment, the index nodes have agreed to replicate all of the monthly data at minimum, the monthly data that we need to run the RIF diagnostics. But if we required some set of data that's not replicated to these index nodes, such as some daily data, for example, we may not be able to run that diagnostic on that given index node. So we've done some testing, and I guess the RIF is technically able to run this, like, for example, high-res MIP data, but we need co-location of the data sets and the index nodes to be able to add the diagnostics to the public version of the RIF. And also the RIF isn't about downloading these big, large artifacts. That is still very much the domain of ESGF. We're about sharing the derived sets of data that come out of that. There is citation is a very particular, a very important part of the IPCC process. We need to encode a lot of information about an execution in the database, so we're able to later query it. In our case, all the results that we produce are immutable. This means that we're able to then roll back in time and return results of a previous time without modifying it. And we're also able to update new diagnostics and produce new results without impacting the old ones. We're going to be producing dynamic provenance records for selected sets of data. So we've been working with TG Data on this citation approach that we're going to apply. There's some proposed provenance template based on an ESM-Val tool implementation, and that GitHub link there. This is still yet to be implemented, so there won't be, currently as it stands, there's not provenance information exposed in the API or in the dashboard, but there's a funded project for Tora which will deliver some provenance framework within the REF within the first 18 months of that project. So we're also looking at producing some static URLs for results as of a specific date. So this is one of the key things that we'd love feedback on early from users to make sure that we're building a solution that's fit for purpose. So I guess this is our first stop for Q&A. So I'm going to open the floor to any questions about what you've seen so far here, with a particular focus on, I guess, are we thinking about this? What is this? Could this potentially be useful to IPCC workflows? And what, I guess, are our assumptions correct about how the figure generation process may work? And any and all questions about the REF as well, I'm more than welcome.
Thanks, Jared. If you want to raise your hand, then I can call on you to ask a question. Or if you have any sound issues, you can write it in the chat and I can raise that for you. Please don't be shy. We get like any questions you have, please do ask now. Manon?
Hi. Yes, I was wondering if there is a list of all the diagnostic and metrics that exist, or something where we can, a list where we can choose what we want to look at.
Yes, there is. There's a DOI that I can post in the chat here now to go to it. That was actually the next slide after this, but yeah, so there's a few different ways you can explore that, either via the dashboard or the DOI of the results that contains the diagnostics.
Thanks.
We got any other questions just now? Jared just added that DOI to the diagnostics list in the chat for those who want to have a look. Okay, maybe move on, Jared, and there's another opportunity for Q&A later, and there's some other channels where you can post after you've had time to reflect as well.
Sure. 2 seconds. Oh, wrong slide. 2 seconds. Great. So let's now dive a bit more deeper into some of the features that are part of the REF. So as Manon was just asking about, there is a set of diagnostic collections that the REF, the Model Benchmarking Task Team developed through some community consultation. There's about 26 of them at the moment, covering 5 different themes across 3 different diagnostic providers. So these have been published and uploaded to Zenodo. As I mentioned, you can also go through the dashboard and kind of see some more information about these diagnostic collections. Each of these diagnostic collections may actually include more than one diagnostic itself, and each diagnostic then actually produces often very different sets of scalar and series values that could be used. So this dashboard that I've mentioned a few times, dashboard.climateref.org, climate-ref.org. This is, I guess, an easy way of navigating some of that information and seeing some of the values before you jump into any code if you're wanting to use that. So we're showing about 40 different diagnostics from CMIP 6. There's about 400,000 different data points as of now, sorry. And we also expose various different pieces of the diagnostic execution output, such as the logs and the figures, for example. This is a mostly complete CMIP set for CMIP 6, but we only used a limited set of variants. But we expect when we rerun it on ESGF, there would be maybe an order of 2 to 3 more values available. So we're going to have a quick look, dive through the dashboard. I'll point out some of the bits of interest, and then you can have an exploration at a later point. And so we're going to move through a catalog of the different diagnostics. Then we're going to dive into some of the files and the values that are available, and then we'll look at the Data Explorer. So if we can all go to dashboard.climate-ref.org. And you're presented with the landing page. Before you start, you will also see a data notice that describes, like what I was mentioning before, the requirement or the guidance that we should be responsible data users of some of these particular of this data. Down here, we can see those numbers that I was representing before, and you can see that there's actually only a 78% success rate for some of these executions. That will hopefully be much higher for CMIP 7, where we've got a much higher threshold for the QA of results that makes it much easier for us to line up data. For example, that ECS demonstration we had before was one of the harder ones, where we've got to join together the many different experiments and track across different variables and things like that. So if the metadata is not correct, we can't join the data together as we would like. So let's go down and look at the diagnostics. This table here shows the different diagnostics that we currently have available, along with a little card for each of them, which describes some information about them. We're able to filter this by the different themes that are there, as well as the different providers that implemented that. So we can see that there's multiple different diagnostic providers. We're also able to see how many executions were performed of this, as well as how many passed and how many failed. So some of them are a bit lower than others. As I mentioned before, the ECS one is hardest to do automatically. Let's look at TCR. So at the top here, we have a card which describes some more information about the diagnostic itself. We're able to link off to the ESM Val tool documentation in this case here, which describes in more detail about the references that were used, as well as some of the outputs and the configuration. We also are able to see the different figures that are outputted from figures that are outputted from those diagnostics, and we can filter them. This diagnostic produces some scalar values, so individual points for TCRE, as well as, in some cases here, they also have different facets, such as the region or the different type of analysis that's performed. So here we have for a number of different source IDs, a number of different member IDs where there's some TCR values. We also have some series values that are exported as part of the diagnostic itself. These may or may not be of interest, but here we have little spark lines where we're able to see the global mean surface anomaly with respect to the linear fit of the PI control run. These things are extracted these are generated as part of the ESM tool output, and we've pulled them out and made them available here. You're able to download those results immediately here. We do have some outlier detection to try and automatically flag the results that may be erroneous. That is relatively rudimentary at the moment, and that could be explored further. We also, for this given diagnostic, we're produced many different execution groups. Some of these have passed, which is the ones at the yes. Some of them have failed for various different reasons. It could be that some of them, the data, we couldn't quite line up the data automatically. Maybe my local replica here didn't have all of the data sets, all of the individual files available. So a lot of these may be cleared up when we do the larger scale run with all of the data available. So let's dive into a single execution. We're able to see more information about that execution. So the files that were produced, we're able to download, say, the NetCDF file that was output, or the all the different figures, as well as view the ESM tool HTML description of that diagnostic. We're also able to, like before, view just the series and scalar values of that given execution. We can see what data sets were used in that particular run, and we're able to then see, for example, what other executions were performed using that given data set. We also able to see the logs of the output. So here, if you've run ESM tool before, this may look familiar to you. So this was the log output of that given run, which is particularly important when something goes wrong. So if modeling centers upload data that hasn't conformed with our expectation of how it's meant to run, maybe some of these results fail, and hopefully if it's a clear and obvious solution, it may be because our assumption's wrong. It may also be because some of the metadata of these input files are wrong. So so diagnostics, each diagnostic, we can drill down through the different execution groups, and then we're also able to see for that given execution group that this has been run twice before, for example. And we could see the results from that older execution group if we wanted to. Another view that the dashboard has here is a curated data explorer, where the model benchmarking task team came up with some different ways that we could look at some of the results that we have. Again, this is split into the 5 different themes of the diagnostics. There's some for some of the diagnostic collections, we have some kind of statements and then some descriptions about why this matters. We're then presented with various different sets of dynamic figures. Each of these values would have come from different runs of an execution, and we're kind of bringing them all together into one figure. These figures themselves are also driven by JSON, so the community could derive their own sets of dynamic figures if they so wish by using this. It may not make a terrible amount of sense here, but this is all just JSON descriptions about how we slice and dice and group data together to make this figure. Let's dive into the ocean and sea ice theme, because that's particularly interesting. So I mentioned here before, there's some outlier detection where some of the diagnostics have been clipped because there are many standard deviations outside the mean. Some other types of figures alongside these box and whisker diagrams are a Taylor diagram, where we're using root mean squared differences and standard deviation to be able to also show how well correlated some data points are, the different models are, and just normal scatter charts as well. Scatter charts as well. For some of the series data, so for example, for the Antarctic Arctic sea ice seasonal cycle, we're able to show these seasonal cycles, annual cycles of the sea ice air extent. And we are able to see for a given model what we're trying, like we can look at a given selected model if we want, and dive into the results there. All these results themselves, we're able to view the original chart results as well as download just those data as well. In this case here, I haven't shown the observation data as well, but we would also be able to overlay the observational record of choice on top of these. And so yeah, we have the southern hemisphere at the top and northern hemisphere at the bottom. So the dashboard itself could be a useful entry point for looking through the different diagnostics that are of interest, finding the diagnostic that's particularly interesting and seeing what data is available, what metrics we're exporting, what figures, what data that's already being exported before you dive into something like we were talking before with the dashboard, the notebook, sorry. Let's quickly jump back to the slides. So one potential gap that is in the current set of diagnostics is the handling of uncertainty in observations. The RIF team did a lot of work to try and codify and standardize how observations are being reported in observation rim reference data sets. This isn't currently playing a role in the diagnostics that we have in the current set of the RIF, but we would imagine that this is something that evolves over time. This is a very important improvement that's kind of hopefully bringing improvements to all different diagnostic providers. There's a bunch of different papers and material that's been prepared by the model benchmarking task team, including this methodology paper at the top from Hoffman et al. That's currently in preprint that describes in more detail about the diagnostics that have been implemented, as well as some of the framework as a whole. So maybe let's park there for maybe 5 minutes, I would say. Okay, so we've kind of gone high level, we've gone down into the details. Now we're kind of going back even further down into the details. So we're going to describe some of the key concepts that make up the RIF. Hopefully that provides a little bit more context to some of the notebooks that you may work through, and kind of give some more information about how we get to the results that we do have. So the RIF works on a 4-step process where we first ingest data sets. So these are input data sets for an observational data sets, where we store all the metadata in those from those data sets into the database, form a data catalog. This catalog contains all the available model and reference data sets that we have available locally. We then do a solve. Now, what we do with the solve is we take this data catalog as well as all the diagnostics that we want to run. We then determine what is the possible set of diagnostics that we could run, check if some of them have been run before, and then queue them up for execution. Now, this execution can happen in a number of different ways, but in this execution, we take this information about what we want to run and then start running, say, ESM-Valtool or ILAM in a specific way to answer that diagnostic. That execution then can either pass or fail. We store the results and all of the artifacts that are produced as that run back into the database. So then the last step of this is this visualize step, where we're able to query across all of the different outputs that we've generated previously to answer the questions that we didn't necessarily know ahead of time. In terms of the input data for the REF, we're requiring CMIP NetCDF files. These are the data sets that are published by modeling centers to ESGF. Because one of the other potential use cases for the REF is modeling centers running it locally before they publish. So we're very much at that CMIP data step where all of the different tooling is able to read and assess those data. Since we rely on these diagnostics defining their own data requirements, they describe what different sets of data are needed to run a diagnostic. That's kind of the main cause of why we need this accurate and consistent global attributes. If we don't have this consistent view on metadata, then we cannot join the data together that we want. That would result in either failing a diagnostic because the data needed isn't available, or it could result in some missing runs that aren't performed because we're not able to find the parent experiment, for example, for a given run. And it may also, in the worst case, result in incorrect values if we're joined together the wrong parent experiment, for example. But as I mentioned before, for CMIP 7, there's been a huge amount of effort go into the QA/QC process. And so hopefully, and this is all prior to publication as well, so hopefully we've caught a lot of those pre-publication errors that make it early in the process, and that should just make it much easier to work with these data in future. Less workarounds. There's also the observation side of the equation here. So observations play a huge role in model evaluation. If there's nothing to evaluate against, sometimes there's not a lot of point doing the evaluation. So these diagnostic definitions also define exactly the data set and the version that should be used by a given diagnostic. The version in this case is quite important to ensure that we're comparing like with like, or that we've got the right coverage, temporal coverage, for example. Significant effort's gone into preparing some of these observation data sets that were not previously CMIP, as well as reaching out to all the different observation data set providers to ensure that they're providing the data with an open and permissive license, which is key to use in a community tool. Some of the reference data sets observation data sets, are hosted on CMIPs, and that's where possible, but not all of those data are currently published on CMIPs. And so at the moment, we have some observation data sets published to an so-called OBSREF collection at CEDA. But eventually, those data sets should migrate across to OBSREF. Again, there's a governance process in there managing that. As I've mentioned a few times now, these diagnostics don't necessarily come from the REF. The REF's providing this framework for running these diagnostics. So these are sourced from existing model evaluation tools such as ESM-Valtal, ILAM, and PMP. Even for the first round of diagnostics, these are well spread across these 3 different packages. So for each of these different packages, we implement a small little wrapper which translates the REF requirements for what a diagnostic looks like into what ESM-Valtal expects. And likewise, in the results of ESM-Valtal, we convert the outputs back into something that the REF expects. So we've effectively come up with one extra standard, but at least it's consistent across all of the different diagnostic packages can produce that same set of output. The REF manages the orchestration at the Conda environments that back all of these different diagnostic providers, as well as the bookkeeping associated with their results and the output. We're also adopting a CMIP, which is a common standard developed at NCAR for describing model evaluation output. So a lot of the output that we generated is written in this CMIP format. So we're not so we're only adding a little bit of an extra standard to the mix. These diagnostics are described as Python classes. So each diagnostic, we have a Python class associated with it, where we write a lot of this logic. A lot of the time, there's a lot of overlap. So once you have one ESM volatile recipe, there may be a relatively small amount of recipe-specific fixes that needed to be required in a diagnostic, but a lot of the mechanism of running an the ESM volatile diagnostic has already been implemented. But yeah, each additional diagnostic still requires a little bit of handmade implementation to match up the assumptions. So here we're seeing a example global mean time series diagnostic where we have some metadata information about it, so a name and a slug. That slug is the bit that you would have seen before. So these are unique to a given provider. We also have this concept of a set of data requirements where the diagnostic itself is declaring, I want to run this particular diagnostic on CMIP 6 data, and I only want to look at TAS results, variable ID, sorry. I then want to take all of those TAS results and I want you to group them by the source, the experiment, and the variant label. These are the different candidate groups that could potentially be run. I then apply some constraints to each potential group that I may want to run in future. So, for example, accesses R1, R1, P1, F1 run for historical is one group, and also accesses R1, I1, P1, F1 SSP. I guess SSP is not as applicable anymore. SSP 126 is another potential execution group. For each of those execution groups, we apply these constraints to check whether we should run them or not. So, do we have all of the full complete time range that we're expecting? Do we want to add in some extra ancillary data such as area cell A before we want to run it? That's how the diagnostic just defines what it's needed, and then the solver's job is to actually take all the information and figure out what is run. The final step here, which is just some ellipses, is this execution step. That's where I guess the science would happen. In most cases here, we're delegating that back to the other packages. So when we have a collection of these diagnostics and a set of input data, we're able to do this filtering, grouping, constraints to determine what should be run. And then we're able to look in the database to work out, have we run this thing before or not? Yes or no. If yes, then we're going to schedule it to be run. If no, we just move on. And the next time we solve, we check whether this is right. So we're checking for whether there's a new diagnostic version that we should be rerunning everything for because a figure's changed or a version of some code has changed. We have this concept of marking some of the executions as dirty if they're kind of incorrect and we want to manually rerun them, or if a new data set appears. So for example, we have a global warming levels diagnostic, which takes all the different, which makes one figure, but for all the different models it has available. So if a new model submits, that particular execution will be rerun. But as I mentioned before, we keep all of the results as immutable objects, so we could still refer to the old results if we need. I'm going to gloss over here about the different ways we can run executions, but just more to allude to the fact that there is various different ways depending on where you're wanting to run this, whether it's on Kubernetes or on an HPC. And it all depends on the scale you're trying to run the ref, as well as some hardware availability. So as part of an execution, we write out a bunch of different output files. Some of them are just generated by the diagnostic itself. So that could be figures, that could be provenance information, that could be some other additional log information. These are all stored in a given directory that becomes immutable. We don't touch again. As I mentioned before, we're using the CMIP format for some output that we're producing. And we go through all these output and extract what we can and put it into the central database. Then that enables us to query across this in future rather than only ever looking at a single execution at a time. One particular interesting thing here is that we're currently supporting scalar and 1D series as the so-called metric values. that was those tables in the dashboard we had before. You could expect that maybe there's also two-dimensional fields that we could also support as metrics if there was a two-dimensional field that was extracted as part of a diagram. But for simplicity, we're focusing on scalars and these 1D fields. That now enables us to cover a vast majority of the default model evaluation output. So for each diagnostic, what the process looks a little bit like, it requires a little bit of glue work to join the ref. The diagnostic itself generally stays upstream. We don't want to fork these packages. We want to make sure that the ESM-Val tool version that we use is the main version of it. We want to not have this fork that goes off and we have to maintain that forever. We want to kind of continue moving forward together. So some of the machinery may be there already for the ESM-Val tool diagnostic to be able to be implemented, but there's still some specific things. So we have to write those data requirements. We have to then look at some of the output and check what we want to extract from it, and make sure we're collecting all the right facets information that we are interested in. We also, for each diagnostic, we also produce a set of test cases. These are a small data requirement that a user could grab some data from ESGF and run that diagnostic locally just to test what the output looks like. This kind of testing has been very useful to ensure that everyone has an example of what the output should look like when they're working with a diagnostic without having to download terabytes of data or run it on one of the HPC facilities. So let's jump back into those tutorial notebooks that went before, and we're going to go back to notebook number 2. So this notebook number 2, so under Climate Ref Tutorials Notebooks number 2. This notebook here describes a few of the key, how some of these concepts then map into the API itself. So yeah, when we run the ref, we've got all these executions that you could see on the dashboard. The dashboard is querying this API to get all that information. So we can do the same thing programmatically here to explore what's available. Again, we're setting up this client, which is a way of accessing the API. It describes how we should connect to this API. The README of the repository itself describes, I guess, how we generate this client. But the first step, one of the first things we may want to look at, for example, is listing the diagnostics that are available. So here we're able to import this given function from this climate _ref_client.api.diagnostic. This is all generated from the API itself. The API has a schema associated with it, which describes the different effectively functions that could be thought of that are available. So listing the diagnostics, looking at a single diagnostic, looking at all the metric values for a diagnostic. How can we get the files for a given diagnostic? Those are all endpoints, and we expose them in a schema, and then we're able to build some tooling around that to consume that. So we're able to query this API without having to know a lot about what actually happens, but underneath the hood. The nice thing here about us generating the schema means that we're able to then, we're showing Python here, but it could equally, if your language of choice is R, you could still access this API and access these same sets of data in a similar manner. So we look at the diagnostic list, this function here, and we are able to call this, and we call it synchronously. So there's a concept of synchronous versus asynchronous communication, In these kinds of notebooks, we're going to always want to be doing synchronous, where we effectively wait until the response happens. Because when we talk to APIs, it may take, a second to get a response back, but we generally want to wait until that response happens. We call the sync function on this class. We pass in the client and we get the data out. And so what this data looks like is well, we can see how long it is. We can also see, I'll run the first cell. We can see that we have a lot of information. This is the encoded version, the result that comes back from the server. And you could drill down into this. We can see, it's a bit hard to see here, but we can see different slugs that were used, different names, different descriptions, all the different execution groups that have been returned that have been run as part of that diagnostic, what different assessment fast track diagnostic collection is it part of. All of this is encoded in this API result if you need. There's a lot of information here, so it does require a bit of experimenting, but we're also interested in how you would want to use this. And so interested in feedback on what kind of functions and what kind of helpers we can do to make this a bit easier. We can then translate that big long response and just pull out, for example, some information such as the provider slug, the diagnostic slug and the name, and make a table. This is all very similar to what we had before, but we're looking at some of the metadata associated with these diagnostics. We're also able to retrieve those metric values, so that table of information we had before. We've got a scalar value, which is just a single value ECS, or it could be a standard deviation with respect of the model value with respect to some observation over a given region. We're able to list the different metric values for a diagnostic using this diagnostic list metric values. And very similar to before, here we're getting the first diagnostic, which in this case is the global climate at the different global warming levels. We're then passing in some information to this list metric values request, such as the provider slug, the slug of the diagnostic, and that we want all of the scalar values in this case. When we run that, we get 44 unique values. And again, we can convert those into a table to get the different experiment, the metric, and the values that were output. And then we could do our other analysis on those results. Likewise, and this is similar to how the ECS was handled in that first example. We also have the example here of how we could handle series values. So in this case here, we're looking at the global mean temperature. We can then do some filtering and look at just a single value from that result. But here we're looking at that same list all the metric values, but now we're asking for some series. And we can plot that as we would expect. Now, we've also got, in addition, some diagnostics also return netcdf files that include all that information. Particularly ESM-Valtal has a lot of information in its netcdf files. These files are able to be downloaded and accessed programmatically with the API. So here we're just simply downloading this file locally and then opening it to see that this description here should look familiar, that it's an X-ray data set with some variables and some coordinates. And then we're able to, for example, take a zonal mean of those results and make that figure as well. So those are kind of like the 4 different types, the metadata, the scalar values, the series values, and these netcdf files, grabbing them and being able to interact with them. And then a lot of the extra work comes from adding a lot of extra information about the that comes from different sources. So I implore you to have a look at some of the other tutorials there. We'll expand this over time with some additional tutorials, and looking forward to your feedback on what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what extra layers we need to add to make this maybe less complex, or if this works as we would expect. So that brings us to the second Q&A point. So we've gone through a few different examples of how you could grab results, and yes, it's interesting to hear any and all feedback or any questions, and hopefully I can answer them.
Lena?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's very clear for me, and I think that it will be super helpful. And my question is more for the point of view of the TSU. So you talked about this database that is generated after the diagnosis. And I was wondering if this is something that is going to together with the output. So is this database is produced for the user? And when you mention it is, so you get it every time, or you need to ask for?
So the database itself is the API is providing a view onto that database, so you don't have to have this big thing that you'd have to write SQL queries to grab the data from. Ideally, the API and these kind of interfaces are providing a simpler and more structured way of accessing the same results that are included in the database. So think of the database as more of the different links between all the different diagnostics. And if you only needed a small subset of it, you just ask for that. But yeah, we're trying to understand whether we do have to be able to copy some of that database somewhere else, but a lot of the time it's referring to like hundreds of gigabytes of files locally, and for example, that may not necessarily be useful.
Yeah, for us in particular, we are very interested in the long-term preservation and the traceability in the long term, which is something that has been a challenge for us, and also to support the reproducibility of the figures in the future, because as you can imagine, the tools evolve. So if you have different versions, after a while, you cannot reproduce the figure that has been used in the report production, which is one thing. And the other is also when you mentioned the database will provide the specific input data you said, for us is something very important, because sometimes this input data also may evolve and there are different versions, and sometimes it's not so easy to access to the actual input data that has been used, especially to have coordinated results between across the chapters, because sometimes some authors can be using some input data in a moment, or a tool in a moment, and the tool can evolve during the process of during the report, even while writing the report. So I can imagine that it might be the case of one chapter producing some output with the tool, and another one some slightly different. So for us is very important, this traceability, and to understand how to trace it.
I hadn't actually thought about snapshotting the database itself on ESGF. That's something we could take away, and that could be something that we end up publishing on Zenodo. As of a certain date, this was all of the results. That's something we may have to explore, but I do want to stress that even with this API, we are trying to we're ensuring that like reproducibility and traceability is a very key part of it. We've taken the hard road to get to where we are, because we're trying to support the use case of traceable science, and that we always save, each time we run a new execution, we save a different copy of it, and we're keeping all the links. So I would imagine that these APIs would end up exposing something like, show me the results as of January 1st, 2027, and it would return the same results now and into the future. But I take your point that we also want to make sure that it does exist longer than, if there's a bug in the API or something like that. So I think there's probably layers to this, and that I would advocate that we save some of these responses, cache them locally in the figure generation process. And there are kind of artifacts of that process. There's also adding some support into these APIs to enable us to specify as of when we want to look at stuff. And then also, how do we ensure the long-term archival of this database and its sets of results? So yeah, maybe it's like a 3-tier approach there.
And also maybe what you asked before in the chat, if someone runs the ref for themselves. And this is something which is, of course, supported. You can take the ref and then run it yourself with your own diagnostic or so. But this is then not going into the central database, right? We have the central database, which is only filled with stuff which is run centrally, where we can also then know exactly which software version and so on was used, because otherwise you can get some results that you don't know what's going on. So the route to get your own diagnostic run and into the database is really only by like integrating it into the ref proper, because otherwise this traceability is just not possible.
Martina has a question.
Yes, thank you. It seems my camera is not working, but I hope you can hear me at least.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Great. So my connection is not that stable. I have a question to the two alternatives which you explained how IPCC authors could use it. So the one idea would be to go to you and ask for a new diagnostic if it's not included. The question here would be, you outlined that there is a procedure of governance. So can you, well, it's difficult, but how long would you expect that this inclusion would take? I think that might be a limiting factor to go that direction. And for the other alternative, the question is, how much effort is it to deploy your own environment? So you have the database, and how much work is it? Can you give a bit more information on that?
Sure. I probably can't answer with great certainty how long it takes to go through that governance process as we're still setting it up. But this is kind of like why we're trying to engage at this point in time, because there is still, maybe not necessarily for the first order draft, but there's still time between now and the second order draft, for example, where to understand what is required. But I can't give a firm timeline on how long it would take to go through that process. There is a little bit of time involved to touch the diagnostic if it's existing in a tool already. There's some documentation time. There's obviously waiting for a Premier next meeting. It's hard to know at this point in time. Maybe the model benchmarking task team leads may have some other statements surrounding that.
I can talk a little. Hi, Martina. So it's gonna be tricky. First of all, the idea of having a diagnostic in the ref is, like, of course, very promising. But if the diagnostic is not in one of the tools yet, it first needs to be implemented there, which is not something that the tool providers necessarily can do themselves, which means that somebody who wants that diagnostic would need to put effort and time in to actually implement it. From there on, it's still the next step to make sure that with the governance structure in place, that diagnostic will be basically fast-tracked to be implemented in the ref, because it is IPCC relevant. And again, that is something, first of all, we need the governance structure, and then at that point we will have to decide on how fast this is going to go. my guess is this is not going to be within 2 weeks. This is more like along the lines of when the diagnostic is ready in the tool of about several months. It's my guess, but I'm like, we don't know yet because the governance structure is not in place yet.
Just to say though that if it's relevant to the assessment fast tracking for AR7, it doesn't need the new governance process to be set up because the CMIP panel can provide that interim governance. So we're not waiting for a new panel to be set up before any decisions can be made for AR7 relevant things. But as Birgit said, it's not just a matter of someone thinking of a diagnostic they want. There probably needs to be a contribution, perhaps from chapter scientists doing some development. And then the integration also has a resource requirement. So there has to be a discussion about where that resource is found and provided. So requirements probably need to be raised as soon as possible to allow these discussions to happen and things to be moved as fast as we can.
Yes, that's a very good point, Eleanor. If you have a diagnostic in mind that you would like to have in the ref, the assessment fast track ref for IPCC, open an issue on GitHub, and Mika and Jared can tell you exactly where that should go. Because then, first of all, we can keep track of the suggestions. And secondly, the CMIP panel and the IPO can actually make sure that we keep track of things and can decide on like how fast this is going to go. So please, if you have something in mind, put it there on the discussion as an issue. Just like one more comment about the resources. We have, for example, gotten a request already about impacts, climate impact diagnostics that require temporal resolution of daily data. This is something that might be a little tricky to implement because at the moment the assessment fast track graph runs on monthly data, and so this is what we requested in the data request, etc. But this is a possibility if the CMIP IPO and the CMIP panel decides that that is something that needs to go, or is like, has a good chance of and being very important for IPCC, that it could be implemented anyway. But this again is something that needs to be discussed then with the CMIP panel and the IPO. But the first thing would be, if for any new diagnostic, put something into the GitHub issues so that we can keep track of things and make sure that we are not missing out on stuff.
And for your second half of the question, Martina, how easy would it be to deploy this? I mean, it depends a lot on where you want to run it. For example, I have the way that they run it on ESGF is using Kubernetes. That's probably one of the more supported ways to run it. That probably isn't something that is just readily available. That requires probably interacting with some DevOps team inside some institute to do. I have a little mini cluster behind me currently running a version of the ref now to try to fit some testing. But the ref doesn't require huge amounts of compute, not nothing, but not huge HPC mini core hours. Still hundreds of core hours, but not tens of thousands of core hours. We have some modeling centers who are running local copies of it at their HPCs, but so far it's been very much, each HPC has been very slightly different, so it's always required a bit of work to get around. You could run it locally on your laptop, the one thing you do need is all the data. So if you've got the local replica of the data that you need, that's one of the biggest steps involved, as well as figuring out where you want to run it. The API side of it is somewhat coupled to the assessment fast track version, but there is some work. We're trying to tease all this apart so we can, the dashboard is very much coupled to the assessment fast track version at the moment. But there is some work there to be done if there's wanting to be some kind of very much more public version of it. If it's more about the API, that is another thing. But yeah, understanding more about the requirements of where it could potentially be run is one thing.
A quick question on what you said. I think for most of the chapters, it would be the better way to ask one of these centers which are already running one of the REF implementations. So it would maybe be good if the TSU has a list of those locations where they have a local deployment of REF.
It still requires...
Because setting it up is really too much for most of the teams, I would say.
It still requires the configuration side of it to encode what diagnostics are run. So I think the question of where it's run is somewhat orthogonal to the diagnostic question as well. So there are two leads there. We should probably be aware of the requirements and the limitations for both of those particular avenues.
Yeah, understood. But an overview, who runs REF with which diagnostics, I think would be also helpful.
Katja?
A little bit similar question. If there is a diagnostic already in and we would like some enhancement, for example, two examples are at the moment there are diagnostics dealing about scenarios or regions, which there will be probably updates in the IPCC cycle. Do we then request that, do we make an issue at the REF or at the tool which provide the diagnostic, or both? You're muted.
Jared, you've got to mute.
Sorry. It's probably useful to do both because, so for example, there will be users of both sides of this. If it only ever gets to, say, for example, some recipe gets updated to support some new AR7 regions, that's still useful widely. Whether it then gets promoted to the REF immediately is another topic. So maybe it's both, but maybe we need some central way of handling and triaging some of this because there's bits that people may want to pick up and run with because it's important for their work as well.
Okay, thanks.
Martina, do you have another question, or is that a legacy hand?
Sorry, legacy hand.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions just now, I think Jared's got a bit of a recap of everything from this session. We've got around 8 minutes left, so maybe I'll hand over to you to run through that.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for the useful questions. And yeah, this isn't the end of this process, so keep the questions and discussion coming. So far we've kind of gone through the concept of the assessment fast track, the fact that there's a dashboard and an API. The dashboard is a view of the data, a very specific view of the data, and it accesses the same results via the API that you would in any notebooks. This is a community-governed resource with a set of diagnostics that are broadly applicable to the wider community, and this is updating in a near real time. I like the term near real time here because it's both precise and not precise at the same time. So that is updating, daily, weekly, daily probably, as new data sets come available, particularly for historical and pre-industrial PI control runs. They're where a vast majority of the diagnostics cover. Then we have, beneath all of that, we have this REF framework, which is a set of, I guess, concepts that we're sharing across the different model benchmarking packages. And it's kind of where the functionality improvements are implemented. Potentially, this framework could be deployed in a different place for an IPCC specific version if we wanted to, before results get publicly added to the ref. That stuff is still all up in the air. But what we really need from you authors is some idea of some feedback on how the data is exposed, and some kind of sense of demand for what is required, because that kind of helps support, motivates and supports the case to implement a lot of this. So after this kind of demonstration, you should have those tutorial notebooks where you're able to go away and explore and see what other useful things you could access. And you should be able to explain what the assessment fast track ref is to how it could support your work. So yeah, as I mentioned several times now, it's all about this feedback that we're trying to gain at this point in the process. So we want to hear if it does work and it does resonate with you. That's just as important as if it doesn't. So there's various different ways that you could ask, provide any feedback. It's either now, either by these GitHub issues that Mika linked to in the chat, or there's some follow-up drop-in sessions in a few weeks' time, I believe. So if there's any burning questions, they can also be raised then. So we're going to take all that feedback and kind of figure out what we're missing and then consider how we move to fill in those gaps. But that feedback is really critical for us to be able to push forward with this. We've also got some discussion board on the ref and the GitHub repository, the link there. There's not a lot there at the moment, but this could potentially be where some more discussion, some more questions and answers about the ref are and where that lives, rather than issues which seem much more focused on a very specific problem or adding a particular diagnostic. There's a bunch of links on this page here. First of all, to our dashboard, our documentation for how one could run the ref, as well as some of the different repositories that we have. As finally, also the ref app itself. This ref app is the API and the dashboard layer, as you've seen it, and that link to the discussions I mentioned before. So yeah, if there's any other feedback that you need to make directly to us, feel free to contact us via the IPO. They're always they've been great at facilitating all of this. And so just to wrap up, I'd like to thank all the people involved, the model benchmarking task team who started this project, the funders of this, ESA and the DOE, the ref development team, delivery team, sorry, so we're a group spread across the globe, various different institutes, and all the different community contributions that have gone into it, this so far. So the ideas and concepts that we've been growing over years that help us do this. Thank you very much.